There's a guy named Asher Edelman who wrote an article in The Guardian endorsing Bernie Sanders. And the reason why this is noteworthy is Asher Edelman is the real-life Gordon Gekko. Now, I'm sure most of you know who Gordon Gekko is. Wall Street is a classic movie. If you don't know who Gordon Gekko is, I recommend going out and watching the movie Wall Street ASAP. But to sum it up for those who haven't seen it, Gordon Gekko is kind of this caricature of a Wall Street greedy prick, and he kind of embodies a mood that was very pervasive and prevalent in real life on Wall Street in the 80s, in Reagan's era, and probably, a lot of this stuff is still going on to this day and going on right now. And he basically has no moral compass. He has no ethical code. He rips people off. He screws over workers. And, that's as good of a summary as I can give in a short amount of time here. But the guy, obviously, after being caught and going through what he went through, now he's reformed. And now he's actually kind of telling you the secrets and the tricks of how everything works behind the scenes and what really goes on Wall Street and why we have a huge, huge problem there today, and why their greed and recklessness is honestly putting the U.S. economy and the world economy at risk. So let's go through some of his points here, and he explains why he's endorsing Bernie Sanders and why it's so important. He says, banking is the least understood and possibly most lethal of all the myriad issues at stake in this election. No candidate other than Bernie Sanders is capable of taking the steps necessary to protect the American people from a repeat of the recent debacle that plunged the nation into a recession from which we have not recovered. The potential for a depression looms heavily on the horizon. As a trained economist who has spent more than 20 years on Wall Street and one of the models for Gordon Gekko's character, I know the financial system is in urgent need of regulation and responsibility. Yet Hillary Clinton is beholden to the banks for their largesse in funding her campaign and lining her pockets. The likelihood of any Republican candidate taking on this issue, this key issue, is not even worthy of discussion. The recession of 2007 to 2016 and the persistent transfer of wealth from the 80% to the 1% is mostly the result of banking irresponsibility precipitated by the repeal of Glass-Steagall Act in 1999. Okay, now, who signed that, by the way? A man by the name of Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton was responsible for signing the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which further deregulated Wall Street and repealed Glass-Steagall. This is one of the main things that's responsible for the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession and the crash. Now, everybody needs to understand exactly why Glass-Steagall was so important, because I feel like it's oftentimes brought up, very rarely is it explained in detail as to what it did. So the purpose of it, the function of it was, if you go to your local bank and you put some money in there, so you cash your paycheck and you got a savings account, you got a checking account, and you go to your bank, you put the money in there. You're doing that under the assumption that it's relatively safe, that, you can go there and you can take it out at any given time. And, for a long time in my life, I literally didn't even know that when you give money to banks that they can turn around and then do all this crazy shit with it. I thought, wait, they're not just holding it? I don't understand that. So what they used to have to do is, if you give them your money at a commercial bank, they can only do safe, secure investments with it. Now, when we repealed Glass-Steagall, what we did is we removed the firewall between commercial banking and investment banking and made it so that commercial banks can also be investment banks. So when you put your money in your local commercial bank, they can now take that money and turn around and do all types of crazy gamblers' bets with it. They can do casino capitalism 101. Where they can do puts, they can do calls, they can do side bets on top of side bets, they can do derivatives betting, which is fucking insane. And as any gambler knows, you do risky things long enough, risky bets long enough, you're going to lose your fucking money. It's what's going to happen. And people have naively assumed for a long time, well, what do you mean? The guys on Wall Street have suits and ties, so they must be principled, they must have a moral code. They're not going to do crazy investments to make money in the short term at the long-term expense of the country, are they? It's exactly what they're going to do. That's obviously what they're going to do. And eventually, the game's going to be over. And we're going to have another giant downturn because we didn't bring back a basic regulation that says, hey, wait a second, when you go to your local bank, your commercial bank, and you put money in there, they can only do safe investments with that. Right now, they can still gamble in any way they want with that. And yes, they're taking massive, massive risks with it and putting us all in danger. So what he's saying is, we repealed that. That's the heart of the problem and one of the biggest problems associated with this. We got to bring that back. Bernie Sanders is the only one even having that conversation. Hillary is not in favor of bringing it back, and then if you press her on it, she gives this bullshit talking point, which is nowhere near true, where she says, he only wants to do that, I want to go further. What? No, going further would be, I'm going to do Glass-Steagall and then some. She says, I don't want to do Glass-Steagall, but yes, I will go further. It doesn't make any sense because she's beholden to the banks. She's beholden to them because she takes so much money from them. Bernie Sanders does not. Okay, he continues here. He says, after the collapse of 2008, the Federal Reserve invested more than $15 trillion to save the banks under the guise of monetary stimulation. At the same time, little or no funds were channeled to the needs of the American people. Yet today we face another crisis of liquidity. This time, Europe will break first, followed by their highly leveraged U.S. colleagues. Meanwhile, the bottom 80% of Americans remain mired in a recession, having seen no increase in their incomes during the last 20 years. Poverty is at its highest level since the 1930s. In some areas of the country, higher. More than 30% of all children live with families subsisting below poverty level. And then finally, he ends the piece with this. Bernie Sanders is the only independent candidate who escapes the malaise of being bought. He is paid for by the people and represents their interests, and you can take that to the bank. Okay. So I recommend reading the whole article because I can only give you some snippets here because of time restraints, but it's a fantastic article and it's super detailed, and he's right about pretty much every single thing that he says. And another point that he had brought up here is, hey, they're also just too highly leveraged, these banks, and that's another problem. And we need to bring back, for example, again, rules on how much you can leverage, and we need to make sure that banks have a certain amount of cash on hand for the amount in bets that they make. You need to regulate their indebtedness. You need to regulate the size of them. As of right now, and he goes on to explain this in the piece, as of right now, the big banks are bigger than they were when they were too big to fail and when they threatened the U.S. economy and the world economy. They're bigger already. So Bernie Sanders comes along and he's like, hey, iceberg dead ahead. We really got to break up these big banks. We really got to regulate how much they can leverage, how much they can be in debt. We really got to bring back Glass-Steagall. He's right on all of these things, and perhaps the most important point is, guys, what happened the last time that we had this issue in 2008? The government rushed in and bailed them out. Now, who's paying for that? Middle-class taxpayers are paying for that. So let me get this straight. The economy goes to shit, and the same people who are affected by the economy going to shit, the same people who fall on hard times, now you got to turn around and bail out the institutions that fucked everybody over in the first place and made the bad decisions. That doesn't make any sense. So Bernie Sanders often says, well, wait a second, the American people bailed out Wall Street. Maybe it's time for Wall Street to bail out the American people. And he's right about that. So whenever something happens, the U.S. government says, oh my God, for the stability of the system, we have to go bail out Wall Street. This isn't a question. We need to do it to keep the economy afloat. It never works the other way. It's never like, oh my God, 30% of all children in the U.S. are living in poverty. We have to bail them out. And they also never say, oh my God, your local deli, your local grocery store, your local dry cleaner, who's a staple of the community, they're going bankrupt. We got to rush in and bail them out. It's necessary. No, they never do it. Why? The American people haven't paid their bribes to the politicians. The small businesses haven't paid their bribes to the politicians. Who did pay their bribes to the politicians? Wall Street. So when they get in trouble, oh my God, throw logic out the window and we have to bail them out, no questions asked. And oftentimes, like the way we did the bailout, there weren't even strings attached. It was, they came to the government and said, hey, yeah, we bankrupted our companies and we crashed the U.S. economy. Give me money, no rules attached to it, and shut the fuck up. And what do the politicians say? Yes, sir. And we even had the debate after the fact. When Wall Street was bailed out, I'm sure you guys remember this, when Wall Street was bailed out, what did many of the companies do? They turned around and paid bonuses to the same executives that made the decisions that bankrupted their companies. Everybody's like, what the fuck? You bankrupted the company. You should be fired. Never mind keeping your job, keeping your pay, and getting a bonus on top of it. And it was bonuses paid for with our tax dollars. Well, now we know for sure. We have the real-life Gordon Gekko, who obviously knows how all this stuff works behind the scenes. He's coming out and he's like, yeah, what are you, stupid? Obviously, Bernie Sanders is the best choice because Bernie Sanders is going to address the fundamental, deep-rooted problems in the structure of our economy. And that does require all these new regulations. It does require going back to sane regulations. It does require breaking up the big banks. And it does require, yes, gasp, wealth redistribution. That's socialism. It's so bad. It's so wrong. Except we know that we live in a world, not just a country, a world where now it's the top 60 people have more money than the bottom 50% of the world. 60 people have more money than 3.5 billion people. Okay, they didn't just work harder. This isn't a meritocracy. Hey, they earned all that cash. No, they didn't. Much of it was inherited, okay? So we have Bernie Sanders who comes along and he says, well, in the U.S., for example, the Walton family has more money than about the bottom 50% of the country. 6 people have more money than 50% of people in the country, 150 plus million people. Bernie Sanders comes along, hey, I think that's a little out of whack. And some people are like, radical. No. If you disagree with that, the radical is you.